this is Alyosha and you're listening to Vision. I'm happy to announce that this podcast is sponsored by Adobe. Photography, design, illustration, video, 3D, Adobe Creative Cloud. It's all the tools you need to express your creativity. Follow the link in the description to get a free trial for 7 days. We hope you enjoy this podcast. And a quick word for the French listeners. Pas de panique, on a fait une traduction de l'anglais vers le français. Traduction écrite qui se trouve dans la description. Donc vous n'avez plus qu'à cliquer sur le lien ou bien le copier-coller selon la plateforme audio que vous utilisez. Je vous laisse profiter de la voix de Christopher Anderson. Bonne écoute.
I think if I were to choose one image that is particularly significant for me, or had touched me in a specific way, or transformative would be the word that I would use, because the picture I'm thinking of is a photograph I made in 1999 in Haiti. I took a boat with Haitian refugees, a small wooden boat. Handmade wooden boat with no motor, no navigational equipment, with 44 Haitian refugees aboard, trying to sail to America. And it's a very long and involved story. I don't know if we have enough time in this podcast to dive into the whole thing, but it was the picture I made that I'm thinking of was in the hold of the boat at night, lit by moonlight that is shining through the opening above us that leads to the deck of the boat. And you see 4 Haitians with whom I was traveling. You see the fear in their faces. And you see water on the wood panels behind them where they're sitting that's coming in from the sea. Because the moment I made that photograph was the moment that I realized that we were sinking. And up until that moment, I hadn't really made many pictures. I can't describe why. Everyone knew that I was there to photograph, but yet it somehow had not felt so, it just didn't feel right yet to photograph in the situation. And at that moment, David, the Haitian, my friend with whom I was traveling, said to me, "Chris, you better start taking pictures now because we're going to be dead in an hour." And it wasn't a joke. He wasn't being, trying to be funny or exaggerate. We were literally saying goodbye to each other at that moment. The Haitians that I knew, Mike Finkel, the writer I was traveling with, in our minds, we understood that this was the end, the long, slow death to the end. And it was at that moment that I started making pictures reflexively. The long story cut short is that we were saved by the Coast Guard, and I'm here to tell you the story right now. But for weeks after that, I thought about that moment and asking myself that question of why take pictures that I assumed would never be seen, because I assumed these pictures would end up underwater with me. I didn't study photography. I'm a self-taught photographer. I didn't really make a conscious decision. It wasn't a choice I made really to become a photographer. It's another boring, stupid story that I won't tell you right now, but I mean, I fell backwards into the profession of photography, and it had not even occurred to me that photography was a profession until I was actually doing it as a profession. And that sounds like some ridiculous story, but that really is more or less a little bit simplified, but that's more or less how it happened. And so I never, I worked hard at the profession. I had never reflected on what that means. Like, what is photography? I didn't have the vocabulary or the tools to have a conversation the way an arts school student might about what does it mean when I make a picture? What does this photograph represent? What kind of photographer do I want to be? Those questions I'd never faced, and I'm not even sure I had the tools to ask those questions. I was a country boy from a small town in Texas, and didn't have the sophisticated thinking about that, I guess. But here I was faced with this picture and thinking about it for weeks afterwards. Like, why did I make this picture that I assumed would never be seen? And the only answer that I could come up with was that the act of photographing, for me, had as much to do with explaining the world to myself as it did with reporting information to someone else or explaining the world to someone else. And that moment, that realization, and that image, not only was that an experience that shaped my life and an obviously significant experience for me, but in pure photographic terms, since this, I guess, this podcast is for photographers, we're talking about photography, and that moment, that realization changed what I wanted crystallized the idea in my head of what I wanted my photography to be about, and had something to do with communicating something about my own experience and communicating something emotional rather than reporting data, rather than reporting an event, but communicating about something about what it felt like to be where I was, to experience what I experienced, or the people in my photographs. I think my whole photographic career since then has been about this search for that, having that essence in my photographs, that thing that communicates an emotional quality about my experience rather than explains anything to you. My name is Christopher Anderson. I'm a photographer and a filmmaker and friend and father. Originally born in Canada, but I grew up in West Texas. I didn't study photography. I'm a self-taught photographer. I started out originally I fell backwards into a job for a newspaper in Colorado in the United States, a daily newspaper. And that was my school for taking pictures. There I did everything from covering the local high school basketball game, to house fires, to city council meetings, to portraits of subjects of the newspaper, this kind of thing. And then towards the end of the Bosnian War, I had a girlfriend from the ex-Yugoslavia at the time, and I followed her to her homeland. And next thing I know, I was making pictures in former Yugoslavia towards the end of the Bosnian War, and started freelancing for magazines and trying to make my way as a photographer, working for magazines at the time, a lot of Time magazine and places like this. And then because of some of my interests, I wound up working for Outside magazine and the National Geographic Society, going to places in the world and different places, and I would wind up staying and kind of working on my own projects and trying to get work for other magazines, and that eventually led to working as a contract photographer, as a photojournalist, primarily focused on, at the time, conflicts, civil unrest, these kinds of things. For Newsweek magazine, for National Geographic magazine. I would also say that, then as I was maturing as a photojournalist, the era of post-September 11th, which the world completely changed then, and I found myself in a very organic way chasing after those events which were transforming the world in front of our eyes. So I spent the next several years in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And in 2008, my first child was born, and I began photographing my family. And that led to me eventually stopping to do what I would call photojournalism. I changed directions on how I operate. And I live in Paris. As things often happen in my in my chain of events of my life. It was a woman. I married a French. My wife is French. We lived in New York. We started a family in New York. But at some point, we both wanted to get out of New York and come back to Europe. And my wife being French, my children being half American, half French, and now I have a French passport. I've immigrated to France, or I've become a French citizen, a voting, tax-paying French citizen. Yeah, so we wanted to be back here and raise the kids here and make life here. It's not any more complicated than that. But I mean, France was a place I'd lived before when I first met my wife. I work here a lot. Yes, Magnum, my agency, one of their offices is here. So it's not like France was just randomly picked out of a hat. It's a place that have been quite connected to for a long time. My first memories of photography is very clear. I had one was my sister. My older sister, who was much older than me, gave me a little point-and-shoot camera when I must have been 12 years old. And I still find this to be like a weird intuition that she had to do that. I don't even remember the circumstances why. It was just a gift that she did. Yeah, I think that the seeds of my love for photography were planted there, maybe. And then I also have another memory of, back in the day, we used to make cassette tapes. Your generation won't remember this at all, but we would try to, you heard your favorite song on the radio, and you would have your blank cassette tape queued up to run. When you came on, you ran and tried to press record so you could make a recording of your favorite song. So you made these mixed tapes, and you might make them for your friend or your girlfriend. You might make a mixtape for them or whatever. Then you might customize the box for the cassette, and you put a picture in there, or draw a picture or something. And I remember finding a magazine and being fascinated with this picture that was inside, and I cut it out and I made a mixtape box with this photograph. Not knowing who the author was, not knowing what the picture was about, just really loving this photograph. As it turns out, it was the photograph, the famous decisive moment photograph of Cartier-Bresson, of the guy jumping over the puddle of water, and it wouldn't be for many years later that I'd be like, oh, that's the photographer who did that picture, okay, and made that connection. But at the time, I remember very distinctly being kind of drawn to that image, but more than just because it was a pretty picture, like feeling a connection with this idea that there was somebody who decided to look at something and consciously organize the world into this image. So those are my two early memories of photography.
You're listening to Vision, a podcast about contemporary photography.
Emotion is really the only thing in photography that I find interesting. Everything else is just a party trick, And what I mean by that is that, especially now in today's visually literate world where we see on Instagram, and we're inundated with images, really good ones, by the way, from everywhere. And it's this visual noise and the sophistication of being able to make photographs by not only professional photographers, but everyone with an iPhone creates this evolution of image making that the iterations come at us so fast. It becomes hard to make images that cut through that noise of all that, and it's become those iterations become so sophisticated. It's all about this, the technique, not even the technique, but the photographers get caught up in like all the compositional things and the sort of visual languages that mark today's photography, and all of these little things that to me are, maybe we might call them mannerism or whatever. I don't like to use that because it sounds so formal, but it's this idea that there's something in the aesthetics or the latest trick or the latest way of using light or the way flash technique you've come up with or film or digital, all this stuff. It really is uninteresting in the end. Sometimes it's done better or sometimes it's done worse. But everybody learns how to do this now, and it's more sophistication on top of more sophistication, and it just becomes like a party trick, that thing you do at a party that everyone laughs at or whatever, and you pull it out when you need to entertain the crowd. But what really is what I'm drawn to, and what I want my pictures to be about is something that goes beyond that trick and really connects with you somehow, that really moves you in a way that makes you stop to think about what is in that picture and what it means to you, how does it make you feel, like really stops you. Well, that's even a separate conversation, because in any genre I can feel that thing. Even in total plastic arts, conceptual photography, that thing can still be there beyond the technique, something that stops me and I feel a connection to, an engagement with, and I feel the presence of that photographer, and I feel their mind connected to something. I may offend a lot of people here, but I'm really uninterested in academic approach to photography. It's when your artist statement has to find a way to make the pictures worth anything, I'm lost already. But it's not about genre that I'm talking about, because whether it's a fashion, photojournalism, portraiture, anything, wedding photography, I don't care. It's about that idea of, when I look at an image, feeling that emotional thing that connects me to what I'm looking at, that moves me, that stops me, that makes me want to care about that thing. And it's not the whatever aesthetic trick that has been applied to it that makes it worth looking at. Because generally, like I said, you can learn all the tricks, and somebody's figured out how to do this, and then somebody else can figure out how to copy it, and yes, I have my own tricks too. I'm not saying I'm above all that. I'm just saying that even the tricks that one employs that's not what the thing is. The thing needs to be the other, that emotional quality. And that's what I get excited about. That's what the interesting thing for me. I've said this analogy a lot, but that movie, if you've seen the movie Being John Malkovich, the whole premise of the movie is this somehow getting to go into the mind of John Malkovich, and you see through John Malkovich's eyes. That to me is the opportunity that photography provides, is that chance to see through someone else's eyes, the way their mind sees and why they see that thing. That is what I get interested about. So I don't even think of, in that sense, of good or bad photography, because they're good techniques, they're bad techniques. Like, do I feel the presence of this person's vision? We talk about inspirations and influences, that it's all mixed together. The past, every bit of life experience, every day, every sunrise, every sunset, every person I meet, every experience I have is an inspiration and an influence in that sense. It forms how I react to the world and how I see the world. And then beyond that, I can name a list of photographers, and I think if you look at my pictures, my photographic influences are quite obvious, actually. Even in my books, there's always kind of a not so hidden reference, very specific conscious reference to one of my photographic influences. I don't think that's hard to figure out. But beyond that, yeah, there are influences. I would say music is a huge influence on my photographic work in a very direct way, not just like, oh, music inspires me. Like, literally, I was formed by punk rock, Growing up in Abilene, Texas, I was formed by punk rock and country music. Two very seemingly opposed things, but you stir up that mix together, and it has something to do with how I see the world. Sometimes I would take pictures listening to music. Sometimes I would think about how I want to take pictures in sort of the tone of that music. visual images have rhythms and have attitudes and have, what is punk rock is about a certain reaction to something and a certain defiance or whatever, and a rebellion, if that's what do you want to call it. And I've felt that in photographing as well, or wanted to express that same thing in visual terms. So it's not like, I listen to punk rock or I listen to music while going out and making pictures, as much as I think about it in the same terms. I identify with it the same way. And like whether it's in a book that I make or a series of pictures, and I kind of think about the language that I'm using or the attitude, the voice that I'm using in that work, and I think about it in musical terms. I mean, obviously painting, literature, all these kinds of things, that they influence me. It's something I think about and shapes me. Now there's a songwriter, Bill Callahan. His text, the way he describes the world in his lyrics, or the way he expresses his own experience through lyrics, is something that I think about as when I want to photograph. Like how do you find the way is that same thing that might be humor without being funny, or haha funny, that is intelligent without being pretentious, that is emotional without being melodramatic. All these things that talk about voice and tone when you have something to say. In my case, the way I say it is visually, but it's all connected. Yeah. I started as a photojournalist because I didn't know anything else. The first opportunities that I had of someone saying, "Here, go make this photograph of something, and we're going to pay you money," whatever. We get, it's a job, was in the context of photojournalism. And naturally, my curiosity about the world and my interest in the world in that sense. And photojournalism was an obvious way to engage with the world in that way. It was an excuse to go and smell and see and feel and experience and taste the world in a very direct way. And I was trying to run away from small town Abilene, Texas. And so being a photojournalist was a ticket to get you to the other end of the earth, It wasn't a conscious thought of, I'm going to go and be a photojournalist. It was, that was the opportunity that presented itself photographically. And it wasn't until later, after being a photojournalist for quite a while, of being like, even realizing that there were other kinds of photography and they were valid, and maybe I had something to say about other things and in different ways than just going and on reporting about a war, And so the second part of that question is, why do I not do it today? And that's a really complicated thing that has to do with starting a family and creatively my interests taking me in other directions, but also becoming exhausted myself. It starts to take a toll on you mentally and emotionally. But also the economy of it, the ecosystem that provided the structure for being a photojournalist in the way I did it doesn't even really exist anymore. And so part of it was like, kind of being forced out. My professional niche is kind of gone now. There aren't the magazines. There are some exceptions, but in the larger context of the Time magazine, the Newsweek magazine that had photographers on contract, and you could make a living purely as a photojournalist. I didn't do any commercial work. I did only working for magazines for doing the subjects that I wanted to do, and that doesn't really exist in the same way anymore. So all those factors together, the time of my life, creatively changing directions, starting a family and realizing like I don't want to go risk my life anymore in that way. All of those things together set me on a different path, which is also just about me changing and growing and evolving as a human being, and my interests taking me other directions. and having other things to say. I had felt like I had said all I could say about a war. Photographing people who are in the public eye, celebrities, presidents, whatever, who have this experience with visual communications. Everybody's kind of very visually literate. Part of the challenge from me is finding a way to cut through or to get past the image that they want to show you, or that their handlers want to show you. So yeah, some of that I think about the technique I might use, how I want to see them, think about photographing them in a way that I haven't seen them before. But then I also think about how to get at an experience with them that might change that, so to speak. And there's a psychological chess match, I'll call it, that happens, especially meeting somebody who's really famous or whatever, to kind of find your way to getting beyond that facade, I think of it almost like your opening chess move, for those of you who are chess players, that the first place you put that pawn, because a lot of it gets decided right then and there of how they're going to react to you as a human being, and are they going to feel comfortable making them feel comfortable to relax and reveal something about themselves to you. I have some photographer friends who describe it as making them feel uncomfortable to put them off guard. It's not my thing, but it's hard to describe that. I think first and foremost, I go in and I try to have, in a very practical sense, if we're talking, two photographers, I go in with a game plan, so to speak. Like, what kind of light do I see them in, and how do I think about lighting this? Thinking about where I'm going to photograph them. Is it a situation that's maybe at their home, whatever, and how I might see them. But then I try to not let that be the thing that takes up all of my bandwidth, because having that framework, that kind of game plan, a general basis to start with, technically, the more important thing is going in and trying to allow myself to really look for what that thing is about that experience of meeting them. And this sounds like I'm getting into hocus pocus here, but I really want someone to look at my photograph of whoever it is and think, like you have an experience with that, and that you somehow felt my experience of being there. Not that I made a pretty picture of that person, not that I'm trying to make that person look bad or good or either whatever. I want that photograph to somehow translate what I felt like being there. And that's what I have to offer the viewer in that sense. The most recent one, Matt Damon. I just photographed Matt Damon recently for the New York Times Magazine. A lot of times you go in, you have a celebrity for a certain amount of time. There's high pressure, so you need to go in with the assistants who are going to set up the lights and help you do this, and you be really, precise in what you do and efficient. And in that case, I really wanted to go. It was going to be in his hotel room in Cannes, and I wanted to go completely alone with just a camera and really not try to have a celebrity photographic session in that sense. And it kind of worked, because I think he even felt like, oh, this is not me doing more press tour, not that I go in thinking he's going to become my best friend, because that's not realistic either, but just going with a small footprint and without all the entourage, and to have what's a more human connection with the subject. So that was my device, so to speak, in that situation. I'm always approaching the subjects that way, of trying to think how to translate that visually, rather than what's the cool lighting trick I can do. And yeah, again, I have I have my bag of tricks like everyone, but I try not to make the photograph about that bag of tricks. I want it to be about something else. And those bag of tricks just become a tool for me to rely on to free me up to actually see something. And that's the important thing, is trying to see something rather than trying to make a good picture. Yes, I mean, I look at it differently because the photographs I make of my family are done in a very different way. I'm not saying like, okay, from now, like right now, we're going to photograph for the next hour or whatever. It's just a part of my life, and photographing them just becomes a natural extension of that. And somehow it's become part of the natural rhythm of my life with my family. There's not a conscious thought process about how much time is devoted to that. When you have, 5 or 10 or 15 minutes with a Barack Obama, it becomes a different thing. And then you have to that becomes the more professional side of it. I rely on my experience of having done it a few times. A situation like that, there's always a lot of pressure, you know. The magazine's time and money, whatever, the situation is, there's a lot of pressure on that. And then there's a pressure I put on myself because I want to make an image that cuts through the noise. I want to make an image that's memorable. But I also try to find a way to then remove that pressure when that 5 or 10 minutes is actually happening, because I need to stay as calm as possible, to think properly, and to allow myself to respond to the situation. The photographic process, I talk about it a lot, a little bit like, it's not unlike being a musician or an athlete that trains over and over again, doing repetitive movements, doing muscle training, whatever. In the case of a musician, you know, you play the piano and you learn to play the scales of the piano over and over again. When it's time to improvise on stage, you're not thinking about, okay, now I need to play C, now I need to play F sharp. You're not thinking about those mechanics. Those mechanics become reflexive. And the same with an athlete who trains over and over again. And then in the Olympics, they're not thinking about like, oh, raise my hand higher, you know, lift the knee, point the toe. That part of it becomes, they're free to perform at their highest level because they've put in the time to train, really very much like a martial art. You know, in martial arts, you repeat a movement over and over and over so that in the moment you can call upon that movement in a way that makes sense. For me, photographing is a discipline in the same way. There's a certain amount of training yourself to be ready for that. Oh, that light is there like that. I know what happens when I use that light that way. I know that I can think about anticipation of if I move and stand over there, I understand what it's going to look like looking back. And then maybe that person might, you know, this might happen in the situation. So I'm, you know, constantly trying to anticipate, but I've also come to the situation fully prepared. And that way I'm not panicked with the details of the technical aspects of what I'm doing. And I think that's important for a young photographer, for any photographer, for myself, whatever, for photographers to keep in mind, is that it's not just about being cool and creative and showing up and making cool pictures. There's a big part of what I do that is about practice and experience and about learning the craft enough so that when I need to use the craft, I don't think about the craft. A friend of mine describes it as being a samurai. It's ritualistic in the sense of a way that you walk through the world, a way that you approach things, a way that you discipline yourself to do certain things, the way you repeat certain movements so that they become second nature. And that is a really important part of what it is I do. One of my favorite artists, Chuck Close, the painter and sort of photographer, you know, he has a famous quote of, you know, something like, inspiration is for amateurs. Those of us who really do it show up and put in the work, because it is in the doing of the work that the creativity comes. And it's so true. If it were just easy to wait around for the inspiration to drop in your lap, then we'd all be doing.
You're listening to Vision. Follow us on Instagram for more news and pictures.
Color is emotional, for me at least. Yeah, I feel color in an emotional way. My earlier work, there was a lot of black and white, and most of that was for technical reasons or a specific reason that I approached something in black and white. I've always thought of myself as a color photographer. But when I worked as a photojournalist, you often have to photograph in situations where, you can't wait around for the nice light or that right combination of colors and things like that. And color is a very precise medium to work with. It can be very limiting in certain ways, technically. Whereas black and white, when you need to make that photograph in the midday sun or whatever, black and white is technically more forgiving. So I would find myself, I chose to do a lot of subjects in black and white at the time for the reasons I was working. Capitolio, my book Capitolio, was black and white because of what I was trying to do with the book. It didn't make sense in color. I started photographing there in color, but it was like there was too much color and I couldn't control it in the right way, and it was distracting from this other thing that I was seeing there. And so black and white became a visual tool at that moment to work with. But I still always have thought of myself as a color photographer. And now primarily what I work in is color. And I find color very emotional. The cherries spilled on the crosswalk photograph is, I don't know how to talk about that. I recognized that the picture is appealing. I don't get me wrong. I don't want to sound like I'm doing false modesty about the picture. I look at it, I like that picture too. But I can't, in my mind, anybody who would have stumbled upon that situation would have seen that picture, because it was just so, it was like the photo gods presented me that situation that day. I was walking across the street in New York doing something else completely, and as I was crossing the street, on the ground there is this what looked like a whole jar of maraschino cherries had just been dropped. And the pattern, and it must have just happened because it was so fresh, and the pattern they made had such an energy. You could feel the impact of the pattern, and so not only there's this pleasing color, and there was a great light on it, and there's the position of the cherries on the ground suggests this explosive pattern that adds an energy to the image that's just like, I wish I could take more credit for that image than I can, but I really do think anybody would have seen that picture if they had been standing there, But yeah, I'm attracted to certain colors, and often that tends to be a red, and I've found a red that I'm particularly drawn to, and a particular tonality of blue. And in my mind, I think of it as the way the world looked through films that were made when I was growing up in the 70s, and there's this, I think it's Gary Winogrand said that he photographs in order to see what the world looks like when it's photographed. That's really true for me a lot of the time. And there was that experience you had with it in film when I was growing up, of seeing this world after it's been kind of translated through this chemical process of Kodachrome film that renders the world not really exactly like you saw it, not false, but not something heightened, or something, the volume is turned up on certain colors and shadows. And I think that appeals to me, and it's that reaction that I have when I see something is kind of already filtered through that. I guess I recognize that there is an aesthetic thing to that. But when I am drawn to it, my reaction to it, this impulsive reaction that I have to seeing light or color like that, really is emotional for me. It's not just, it's not, I can't describe it any other way. It's not calculated. It's not intellectual. It really is like a dog, like my dog barking at the scooters that drive by the house. Like you can see his brain. It's not like he decides that he needs to, now it's time to bark. It's something in him, just like the brain triggers and makes him bark. And for me, it's the kind of the same thing. It's just this, it's impulsive. Photographing for me is completely impulsive. It's reactive. I started working with long lenses and eliminating context because in the case of going to China, I was invited to go by an arts organization to go and make a series of pictures in China. And getting there, part of my feelings about photojournalism, and in that particular case, being a white Western male going to somewhere else and offering you my vision and my observations of how people live, just seems so not my place to do that. And me, at the time, me really questioning ideas of representation and this kind of thing, but also just it feeling so superficial to go and make a comment of like, oh, in China, here are the young people who also wear Nikes, here are young people who also buy iPhones and go listen to rap music. Our world has moved so far beyond that sort of observation, when it was interesting to someone in Paris what maybe, a viewer in Paris might see a person in Shanghai, the way they prepare their meals or the way they fish or whatever. We don't live in that world anymore. We're completely interconnected. Of course, people in other parts of the world do things the same way that kids in, wherever. Of course, they're all wearing Michael Jordan t-shirts and listening to Kanye West. And, that is not interesting to me anymore. And I don't know how to go make a comment about that in China. So I'm invited to China, right, to make pictures, to offer my point of view by a Chinese organization. My first thought there was like, oh, I'm interested in these faces and these things that I'm seeing, and me kind of whatever. I don't want to get too philosophical on it, but eliminating time and place seemed a device to remove this from a documentary or journalistic context, and was a device to allow me to do something that could be more universal in that sense. I'm hesitant to use the term, maybe poetic, and then also sort of falling in love with with what happened aesthetically with it, because there was this quality of light and this artificial light everywhere that's filtered through all this pollution, and the idea that these pictures could be anywhere. You could make those pictures anywhere now, and in New York, not anywhere, but New York, Shanghai, Hong Kong, Berlin, whatever, they really could be something we see in any situation. And there was as much a commentary about that. If I really want to go in deeper, we talk about, I grew up in the 70s and 80s, where the future was represented to me as like either one of three ways. There was either Star Wars, where the future was like totally pristine and perfect and beautiful, or there was Mad Max, where the future was, this dystopian future where everything is, post-apocalypse. Or this other thing, which is Blade Runner, where it's this sort of something in between, and the, you know, East has become West and West has become East, and all these influences have kind of all stewed together into this thing where New York is Shanghai and Shanghai is New York, and I think that was what visually struck me about the place when I arrived in Shenzhen. Was like, oh, I was told the future would look like this, and it does actually. That artificial light everywhere, that total blending now of cultures where you know, it's all become one sort of general consumerist culture, where it all looks the same, except I happen to be in China making the pictures. Cop was not necessarily in a conscious choice to make the aesthetics that way. I think it was working with a long lens because it was easier to photograph the cops that way. And something similar was also happening with the, you know, the idea of removing the context. And they're not about, you know, it's not, oh, here's a cop giving someone a ticket, or here's a cop arresting someone. It was just about a portraiture. And there it was really about, even the uniform was a way of also sort of stripping away context. That sounds counterintuitive, but the idea of they're all in the same uniform makes the uniform in some ways then disappear. It's like a control test, you know, where it really does become about the face and I think that was what I was drawn to. It was less conscious it was not as conscious as when I went to China. Filmmaking now is like, it feels like a new challenge for me, and I'm excited by that. Not that I'm bored by photography, but I'm not as surprised by photography anymore. I don't mean that to sound jaded, but it's like I know my way around my craft. I am comfortable being thrown into a situation and figuring out how to climb my way out of that hole photographically. And whereas filmmaking, every step of it, every time I do something, I feel like I'm learning something completely new and facing a completely new challenge. I also like the fact that it's collaborative, whereas my photography is not as, you know, it's much more of a individual venture, but and so it's kind of they're related, but they're not, you know. He doesn't necessarily mean, okay, filmmaking is a visual medium, but it doesn't mean that being a good photographer translates into making good films, because they're cousins. They're not the same thing. Yeah, so it's an exploration for me, and learning is always fun, and doing something new, being challenged creatively in different ways. I'm enjoying that. Right now, I'm just doing short things, but yeah, I mean, I dream of one day doing some kind of. I would dream of doing long form narrative in film, but even saying out loud that I dream of that sounds like hilariously pretentious, because it's every bit that I learn shows me how much more I don't know. I don't know if that could ever be a reality, but yeah, I'm learning now. I'm in my infancy in that sense. How do I approach making bookmaking? It's always a little bit different. It depends on what the project was, and every single one of them has been just a little bit different. The current one, the book that has just come out, Son, is actually the remake of a book I did in 2012. So it's even strange by itself, because, you know, the book I made then, for years, it's been out of print for years, and I, you know, people have asked me when I would remake it and reprint it or whatever. And in thinking about now reprinting it, was it going to be just a facsimile of what I had done before? Would I expand it? And I think I played around with different ways of maybe expanding it or adding new images in. And it became apparent during that process that no, I wanted to keep that thing of the first book in there. I wanted to retain that because there was a certain thing at the time, a certain naivety to the way the first book was made that had a certain charm to it that I wanted to preserve. But then also add in newer material by making a chapter 2. And then in this specific way with my editor at Stanley Barker, deciding that, wouldn't it be nice if it kind of fit the same format as Pia, which was just released last year. And so we actually expanded it in a way so it would be physically the same size and the same materials and the same design as Pia, just with a color change to the cover. And so that eventually this could, maybe it might become an expanding set, One day there's the book of Marion, my wife, or maybe the dog Echo, I don't know. Maybe there's another Pia book one day, I don't know. But it could be perhaps this dynamic, evolving set that can be seen together as a set of work rather than just individual books. And so that was kind of the planning on that. But every book has been really different. I kind of start working on something. Maybe I usually don't have the idea that it's a book until sometime during the process, and then I think maybe this is a book. And that, as I'm working, that thing will start to take shape in my head, and even in the physical way, like it becomes a large book or a small book in my head, and physically I start thinking about the physicality of how that changes and the presence that book has, and I love playing with titles in my head, and my books tend to have kind of one word titles. And then I think about I start thinking about fonts and colors and that kind of thing, constructions. Even playing around with sequencing to some degree. So a lot of the book happens in the process of doing it. It starts to take shape in my head. And then at the moment that it becomes the book, the actual bookmaking part happens pretty fast for me because I've spent so much time with the material and thinking about its form that it'll take, that the end part becomes just kind of like hammering out the details rather than having this big pile of pictures and thinking, okay, now let's try to make this into a book. By the time there's a big pile of pictures, I've already thought deeply about what the book might be like. And that also then in some ways shapes the pictures that I make, because usually I'll start towards the end maybe looking for pictures that fit specific holes that I think there might be. I don't like doing that too much because that starts to suck out the organic way the pictures are made. But yeah, sometimes there's a picture here and there that it's like, man, if I just had that piece of connective tissue. But yeah, really the books have all been different. And they have their own personalities that way. And they're made at different times in my life when I'm a different person, or I'm going, my experience at that moment is different, or my interests at that moment are different. And that informs and shapes the way the books that are produced. I can't imagine now today making a book anything like Capitolio, for instance. It was a very specific statement about a specific time in my life on every level, not just what the subject was, but what the book was about, what the book said, and the construction of the book, everything. The way the pictures are photographed, the whole thing. I'm not disowning the book. It's very much me, but it was a step in my process. The same way I can't imagine doing the same things as I was when I was 18 years old. I can't imagine dating the same girl that I did then, or whatever, or wearing the same T-shirt that I might have then. It's very much connected to the stage of life I was at. my future photography, you know, man, I hope I can continue to make some pictures that at least I find interesting. I don't know what my next, you know, project or subject is. That's a little bit like falling in love, and it doesn't just happen, you know. I had published 2 books recently, and I don't have the third one in my back pocket yet. You know, there's a couple things maybe from my archives that I'm looking at maybe, but the next thing that I go out to photograph, to like try to apply my vision to, I haven't come up with that at the moment, and I'm not sure what that is. And sometimes that's scary, and sometimes it's like, you know, I'm a farmer, and you know, we just harvested the wheat, and now we gotta wait for the planting season again, and then wait for the rains, and you know, all that comes in good times, and I can't expect to have that subject right away. So I you know, in the meantime, I try to feed my family and work on the things that are in front of me. You know, not yet sure what the next project is.
Thank you for listening to Vision. If you like the podcast, rate it and share it. It helps us a lot. See you soon. Bye-bye.